Welcome to the Jewish Christian Studies podcast. This program is sponsored by King's Evangelical Divinity School. And now, here's your host, Rubén Gómez.
Dr. Motti Inbari is professor at the University of North Carolina, Pembroke, specializing in Jewish history, politics, and Jewish-Christian relations. He earned his PhD, MA, and BA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is the author of 6 books, including Christian Zionism in the 21st Century. Dr. Kirill Bumin is Associate Dean of Metropolitan College and Director of Summer Term at Boston University. His research focuses on Christian Zionism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Jewish-Christian relations. He is a former Fellow of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations and co-author with Dr. Inbari of Christian Zionism in the 21st Century, published in 2024. Welcome again, Dr. Inbari, Dr. Bumin. We are delighted to have you on once more to continue talking about this excellent survey, excellent in terms of how professional it is and how eye-opening it is. Perhaps the results are not what we would like them to be, but again, that's the snapshot of what our current situation in the UK is like with regards to opinions about Israel and the Jewish people. But I would like to start this conversation by asking you this question. Now that you have the experience of having conducted a survey, very similar surveys, both in the US and the UK, what's the landscape that these surveys show us in terms of affinities and differences between both countries?
Yeah, there are a number of factors that explain the differences between the United States and the United Kingdom in terms of support for Israel that are worth briefly reviewing here. I think that the visual illustration is particularly poignant and stark and will help your viewers and listeners understand why we see such contrast between the two English-speaking countries. So in terms of support for Israel, as we've mentioned in the previous segment, biblical arguments, religious arguments, theological arguments, eschatological arguments matter greatly. And here you could see just the basic beliefs related to the role of the Jewish people in Israel expressed by the British and the American people. And you could see that the prevalence of certain beliefs in the U.S. is far greater than it is in the United Kingdom. For example, only 17% of the British say that Jesus was a Jew versus 28% of Americans. The Bible says Christians should support Israel. Less than 10% of the British endorse this view. More than 20% of Americans do. Similar contrast exists in regard to Israel is important to fulfilling the biblical prophecy, which is a position that's deeply embedded in the premillennial eschatology. Only 12% in Britain and more than 21% in the United States endorse the sense of importance that Israel plays for the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. Same thing as we could say in regard to the Abrahamic covenant. You could see that roughly 36% of British believe that the Abrahamic covenant continues to matter and exists today. That number is almost half of the American respondents, 48.2%. We also see relatively stark, almost twofold differences. Just for a second, go back to the previous slide, Motti. With regard to the supersessionist positions, right, that covenant has never existed or has ended, while supersessionism is present in both countries, it's about twice as prevalent in the UK as it is in the US. Thank you, Motti. With eschatological views, we could see that in both the US and the UK, amillennialism, a position that ascribes very little importance to the Jewish people in the end times or to Israel in the end times, tends to be the most prevalent eschatological position in both countries. But again, we see significant differences in regard to support for the most pro-Israel and pro-Jewish position, which is premillennialism. Indeed, there's almost a twofold difference in that perspective, which I think is very important. As I've mentioned in the previous segment, we repeatedly find that Catholics tend to be less sympathetic towards the state of Israel, either more likely to express position that they support neither Israel or Palestinians, or more likely to lean in favor of the Palestinian people. Again, you could see these effects both in the United States and the United Kingdom. Protestants tend to be more likely to express support for Israel than Catholics. Similarly, we see that there are differences in socialization patterns between the US and the UK. In the US, in part due to the fact that there are simply more Jewish people to socialize with, the levels of socialization is far greater than we observe in the UK. And we also see that the socialization related to socializing with other pro-Christian, pro-Israel, or pro-Jewish Christians varies greatly. As the previous slide has shown, such socialization is more common in the US than it is in the UK. Exposure to the Jewish people is more common in the US than the UK. And that, of course, increases the likelihood of strong support for Israel. If we look at ideological perspectives of our respondents, we see that there are far more conservatives or right-leaning respondents in the US than there are in the UK. And as we've mentioned in a previous episode, at the statistically significant levels, we repeatedly find that conservative ideology or right-leaning ideology is associated with greater support for Israel. And this is just a more kind of poignant way of illustrating these stark differences. You could see that conservative right or right-wing respondents, back to the previous slide, Motti, are less than half of the American levels of conservatism. And that, of course, translates into less probability that a British respondent expresses support for Israel. Thank you. The biggest contrast that you see in regard to the two-state solution here between the British and American people is, of course, in regard to the largely supportive and largely opposed portions of the graph. As you see, those that sort of fall in the middle of that distribution, neither support nor oppose, 4 to 7 responses on a 10-point scale. Their numbers are roughly the same. It's when we look at largely opposed and largely supportive categories where we see pretty stark differences between the two societies. And when it comes to anti-Semitism, we see that in both the US and the UK, those that are more concerned about anti-Semitism are more likely to support Israel. But again, the prevalence of these anti-Semitic, of concerns about anti-Semitism in these countries varies. So in the US, American respondents are more likely to express significant concern than the respondents in the UK. More of the analysis of odds ratios, which allow us to assess the relative impact of one factor or another factor on anti-Semitism or on support for Israel, we see that concerns about anti-Semitism have deeper, more profound impact on the attitudes towards Israel in the US than they do in the UK. The difference is not huge, right? 32.8% increase in likelihood of strong support for Israel in the US versus 26.5% in the UK. But, this is beyond just the margin of error and certainly in part explains the profound differences between the two societies that we see in support for Israel. This is kind of a complicated chart for folks to understand, but it's actually much simpler than you would expect. Basically, there's a negative effect associated with endorsement of social justice views for every level of intensity, for every level of a greater agreement of support with social justice issues. That respondent is less and less likely to endorse a positive view of Israel. So as social justice concerns increase in their intensity, negative impact on support for Israel also increases. There's this linear effect. The more concerned you are about social justice issues, the less supportive you are. As I've mentioned earlier, for some folks, this could be a partly counterintuitive finding. Why would negative opinion of Muslims necessarily result in stronger support for Israel? Or why would a negative opinion of Muslims correlate with stronger support for Israel? As we've explained in a previous segment, much of that, I think, is rooted in the post-9/11 era and the war on terror that took place and the impact of Middle Eastern terrorism on some Western societies like the US and the UK. And you could see that, again, in the US, respondents are more likely to have a poor or very poor opinion of Muslims than in the UK. And as a result, we see that the correlation between the opinion of Muslims and support for Israel is stronger and more consequential in the US setting. Generational schisms are really important. We repeatedly see them in the US. This has been one of the most consistent findings in the 7 years I've been doing this research, but they're also present in the UK. It's just as you see here, the differences are much more stark in the US context when we compare the different age cohorts than they are in the UK. The older folks are substantially more supportive of Israel in the US than they are in the UK. But even when we look at the UK numbers, we still see that 18 to 29-year-old respondents, only 14.1% of them express strong support for Israel versus 22.4% among 65-year-olds. These numbers are even far more substantial. It's really threefold difference when we look at the US numbers. Again, the reason why the US posts much stronger sympathies towards Israel than we see in the UK. As we mentioned before, British Asians tend to be less supportive of Israel in the UK. And again, you could see the contrast between all other racial and ethnic categories, which we, by the way, use a common survey question that is used in British surveying of different racial and ethnic categories. And we have tested for possibility of statistically significant effects among all racial and ethnic groups, but only found it in regard to the Asian respondents. And you could see that there is a fairly great contrast between the Asian respondents and the rest.
Okay, so we did find something very interesting in the survey that we were not expecting. We were expecting to see something similar to the United States, where young people, of course, we saw it and we talked about it, tend to be less supportive of Israel. We did expect that to be also in the United Kingdom. But in terms of, we saw something unique, interesting, but also disturbing. So studies consistently show that younger generation in the United Kingdom are generally less religious than the older generations. However, our study found some indications that young British Christians are exhibiting the opposite trend. Young generation of Christians in the United Kingdom may be more religious, I repeat, more religious, observant than the older generations of Christians. So this chart breaks the church attendance. How often do you come to church according to ages? And if we look at those who say that they come at least once a week, you see the blue bar at 43%, almost 43%. These are ages 18 to 29. So you see almost half of this age cohort come to church every week. And if you look at that, those who come to church every week, and you can see how the numbers drop according to the age cohort, those who come the least are the 65 and above that stand at 16%, 17%. Yes. So you see the difference, the stark difference between the older and the younger cohorts. And if we look at those who never come to church, yes, or seldom come to church, these are very similar numbers. Those who say never and seldom, according to the age cohort of 18 to 29, they stand at 5%, 5% while 30% of the older and so you see, according to church attendance, the numbers of church attendance, young Christians coming to church in much greater numbers than the older ones. And if we'll move to the next, you can see the following questions. Do you believe God's covenant with the Jewish people remains intact today? This is a little bit puzzling result, because if you see that the age cohort of 18 to 29 and then 30 to 45 agree with this statement in much higher numbers, close to 50% with the older people. And if you look at the I don't knows, this is also something that is worth paying attention. So 50% of the 65 and above, and the 50% of these say I don't know. Yeah, whereas this lack of confidence, don't know how to answer this question, is much smaller at the younger age cohort, which means that they are much more, they're stronger about religion. And the National Evangelical Association, the definition of what you feel toward the Bible, and you see very clearly how the age 18 to 29 stick up in all of those categories. There are between 40 to 50% agreement that the Bible is the highest authority of what I believe. Look at the comparison, 44% of younger people compared with 16% of the older people. It's very important for me to personally encourage non-Christians to trust Jesus Christ as their Savior, 40% compared with 10%. Jesus Christ's death on the cross is the only sacrifice that could remove the penalty of my sin. Almost 50% of young people compared with 17% of their grandparents thought only those who trust in Jesus Christ alone as their Savior receive God's free gift of eternal salvation. 43% agreement among young people compared with 13% of their grandparents, 65 and above. So we see a very strong age difference here in these categories of religious beliefs and religious attendance and religious views, which is very interesting. And it's a reversal of trends. Recently, just Pew Research in the United States released its big report about religion in America. I started reading it yesterday, and you definitely see an opposite trend in the United States, where young people are less, not more. But in the United Kingdom, we see young people are doing more devout, more believing, more agreement with religious beliefs. And we've seen in the United States that if you are more stronger, if you have a stronger belief, you tend to have more supportive views of Jews and Israel. This is what we have understood. This is what we learned in the United States. But this is not, and I repeat, this is not the case in the United Kingdom. In comparison to under 30 American Christians, much larger proportion of young British Christians endorse anti-Semitic tropes and unsympathetic views of Israel. The religious revival does not seem to make them pro-Israel or less anti-Semitic. And I'll show you the numbers. So for the trope that Jews have too much control over the United States government, about a third of the younger people agree with that, between a quarter and a third, compared to 17% of 65 and above. You can see how the trends move. Younger people agree with all of those tropes in much higher numbers. Let's look at Jews talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. 36% of young people compared with 28. Okay, the difference here is not that big. And Jews are more loyal to Israel than to this country. Okay, there's an agreement according to all age cohorts on that statement. But if you look at Jews have too much control over global affairs, 15% of 65 and above compared with it's almost double younger people. So this is just an example that illustrates, which, ought to be a teaching moment for you people who are listening to this podcast, that in the last 60 years or so, there have been much of a reapproachment between Jews and Christians, and much of the negativity that used to be part of the Christian church in the past toward Jews have disappeared, and there was more of a how do you say it? Like there's more of like reconciliation between Jews and Christians. And what we see here in the numbers, according to British Christians, young British Christians, it's all going to the trash. And we are going to 0.0 again. There's something very bad happening here in those regards. And this is something that British Christians have to be aware and to pay more attention. And I will read what's on the slide. British Christians are less supportive of Israel and less likely to have a positive perception of the Jewish people than American Christians. Their views include a higher percentage of stereotypical views of Jews compared with American Christians. Catholics are the least pro-Israel Christian denomination in both the UK and the United States. Protestants generally hold higher levels of support for Israel. Unlike under 30 Christians in the United States, young Christians in the United Kingdom tend to be more religious than older generations of Christians. Unlike the younger American Christians who tend to hold favoritive views of Jews and Israel, young Brits are significantly more likely to hold more negative opinions of Jews and Israel than older British Christians, although they hold higher levels of religiosity. And I think we are done with our presentation.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Now, focusing a little bit on young Christians, it seems that we are facing a paradox here. Higher religiosity versus higher levels of anti-Semitism. Let's see if we can unpack this a little bit. All understood that reading the Bible and attending church services would make us more aware of the unique place of the Jewish people in God's revelation, right? So why do you think young people who actually read the Bible and attend church services, why do you think they would become less supportive of Israel and the Jewish people rather than more? Is there an explanation for that?
Well, being exposed to replacement theology, for example, and if you're a frequent church attendee, being exposed to it repeatedly, perhaps on a daily basis or once a week for years and years, that would certainly result in lower support for the Jewish people and higher proclivity toward anti-Semitism. I think that in part explains why we observe what we observe. The media influences and the fact that the young people are more likely than the older people to express liberal, progressive positions and social justice concerns are yet another reason why young people are more likely to gravitate to the pro-Palestinian perspective and why they may express positions that are anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, what we find again and again, and that's at the statistically significant level, is that anti-Zionism, anti-Israel sentiments correlate quite strongly with anti-Semitic views. So there's this continuous argument both in the broader society as well as in the academia, whether anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. And there are certainly nuances and differences between the two. But we, in our research, with the specific anti-Zionist questions that we ask, we repeatedly find these pretty strong parallels that divides across the countries. So we observe it in all English-speaking countries that we have surveyed so far.
Right. Yeah, so I just want to repeat what was been said, and it's not enough to come to Jesus. Also, what's the message that you get?
Yeah, that's a very important point. Yeah.
I had one more thing, right? And this is the million-dollar question to which we don't have an answer, neither in the US nor the UK. There's kind of two ways to think about the influence, how opinions change as someone ages. Life cycle theory, which basically says we grow older, we become more conservative, more set in our ways. And as we grow older, in this specific instance, perhaps young people become less anti-Semitic, more pro-Israel, just like their elders. Or perhaps there is another possibility, and that is the generational cohort theory, this notion that there are certain fundamental things that happen during the formative young years that will forever change the way someone perceives a particular issue or particular situation. For instance, folks that grew up during Great Depression, even though they aged, they continue to favor greater government intervention in the economy, more social welfare, and more social services. And so if we adopt that perspective, perhaps that negative attitude toward Israel and these anti-Semitic feelings that some young people have acquired in their young formative years, they could potentially persist with them through the remainder of their lives. There is no way to tell right now. The only thing that we can do is to continue to conduct surveys over time to be able to assess how this cohort's attitudes change or whether they remain the same.
Actually, the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, just posted some results of their latest survey on anti-Semitism, and that 46% of the adult population worldwide harbor negative opinions about Jews. Now, that's a pretty alarming
Let me add to this one more thing. What they classify as deeply troubling is when someone agrees with 16 out of 11 tropes, right? So not just one, but you have to agree with 6. And so what they're essentially saying is half of the world is agreeing with at least 6 anti-Semitic tropes. That is...
Which are the tropes found in your survey?
Exactly.
Right?
We use ADL's methodology to test anti-Semitism. And so that is absolutely deeply concerning, right? Because we're not even counting the people that have endorsed 1 to 5 tropes. We're just counting the ones that endorsed 6 or more.
So
Kirill, maybe you say something about the results that we found in the US, the United Kingdom, and Ireland.
Yeah. So what we found was that on average, an American respondent in our survey endorses 1 trope. In the UK, the average British respondent endorses 2 tropes. And in Ireland, an average Irish respondent endorses 3 tropes.
Yeah, well, thank you for that information. It is deeply troubling, but obviously the US and the UK are far from the statistics that ADL show for the world. From that 46%, almost half of the world population, that's astonishing. But one of the things that stand out from the data in your survey is that anti-Semitism is well and alive, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. Would you care to comment on that?
And actually, what we see among young British Christians is alarming because it might tell us that it's even going to get worse, not better. And that kind of reflects on what I've been saying earlier, is that a lot of progress has been made. 200 years ago, 300 years ago, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the church, but in the last 50, 60 years, it was reduced, and there's some people see some commonalities. There's a civilization that is, like we call it, Jewish Christian civilization. It is some shared scriptures, and shared beliefs, shared views, 10 Commandments, and so on. But we are seeing is a very scary moment now that might all be going back to zero, to the point zero, and everything that was studied and achieved is completely disregarded, and we are going back to the old patterns.
And also, there's a question about the political leanings of people and the correlation between that ideology and anti-Semitism, because not so long ago, anti-Semitism was thought to be something of the right or the far right. But your surveys shows that the more left you lean in your political views, the more chances that you will be somehow anti-Semitic or have negative opinions about Israel and the Jewish people. Is that a fair assessment of the data?
Particularly in the UK, that's true. But more generally speaking, in both the US and the UK, we observe this situation where historically it's been appropriate and correct to blame the far right for fascism, for anti-Semitism, support for neo-Nazism, which is all true. But we oftentimes ignore the far left, which also expresses virulently anti-Semitic views. And it has become much more prevalent in the US. We see that, for example, in the protests that take place in some of these elite universities like Columbia. And we certainly see that in the UK data as well.
So I just want to add to that is that the negativity of the far left is typically it's in the context of Israel. Yes, it's
Right.
not anti-Semitic, it's Israel, it's anti-Israel. But I think our numbers show that those things tend to overlap, although there are nuances, but tend to overlap.
Yeah, and also, of course, what used to be anti-Jews is now very much anti-Israel in a sense. For instance, some of the tropes that your survey includes that people hold to, like genocide in Gaza and targeting Palestinian civilians, I mean, those anti-Zionist claims are very similar to the blood libels of yesteryear. I mean, on the surface, things have changed, but the trope is still there. The core, that Jews are against us and are killing us, and deliberately so, is still there. So that's why I was asking about, being the hatred from the very beginning that it is. Anti-Semitism is still very much alive,
And
even if it takes different forms.
the correlation between far left and anti-Semitism is, I guess, a moderately recent quote unquote discovery in the West. But as a Jew who grew up in Soviet Union, which was definitely far left, right?
Mhm.
I can tell you that it was anti-Semitic, not only at the official level, but also in the cultural level. And so this correlation between left-wing ideology and anti-Semitism, not just anti-Zionism, is, has been present for a very long time.
Well, as I said in our previous podcast, your survey is hugely important nowadays. And so, do you have any expectations on how these trends are, which way they're going to go in the next just a few years, really?
It's a little bit easier to speculate about the next couple of years than it is, over a more prolonged period of time. And the reason why I say this is because I think that the Israeli operation in Gaza, in the West Bank, to root out some of the radical Islamist groups like Islamic Jihad or Hamas will continue. And as a result, I think, and also the situation in Gaza will not be resolved overnight. And so as a result, I think the kind of fuel that has fueled rising anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the last year and a half, I think that'll still be present and continue. But what happens in longer term, especially in regard to these young people, it's really difficult to say. Again, there's plenty of evidence from the research that people do change their minds as they grow older, but that doesn't mean that happens on every single subject. And so it's $1 million question, and, we look forward to unpacking it and maybe in the next 10 to 15 years.
Right.
Yeah,
So-
but I do want to say that, we conducted these surveys, both the US and the United Kingdom, in the context of a war that has been taking place in Gaza. And at some point, this war will end. Of course, the issues will stay, and maybe the end of the war some people may become more relaxed, maybe.
Mhm. But also, in a few years' time, there will be no one alive with living memory of the Holocaust. The Holocaust will only be a fact of history, even, disputed by a significant group of people, but something that happened back then. But there will be nobody to remind us how terrible it can become when we let anti-Semitism take hold of our views. So that's also troubling. I mean, yeah, war will stop at some point, and then there will be another one and whatever, but also the witness of those who actually lived through that period of time, that horrible, they will not be with us. So young people will not be able to hear from eyewitnesses And that's a bit concerning. It is to me, at least, a bit concerning, because that means that failing that, we will have to emphasize how we teach, how we share with people, what happened back then, and so that never again becomes really never again.
Yeah. And we see this troubling, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, which we called Holocaust inversion.
Yeah.
You take and you just try to label it on the Jews. The Jews are now doing Holocaust. There's a psychological thing here that I don't know how to explain it, but I think maybe it relates to guilt. Maybe it relates to, other things. Though British people were the ones who, they were fighting the Nazis. They were not collaborating with the Nazis. So why would British people will do this inversion?
Mm. So before we close, as Jews yourselves, could you give us, what's the word, not perhaps advice, but could you share your thoughts on how Christians could do more to address these issues? I mean, based on all the data that you have discovered and shared with us, what would you say Christians can do on a practical level to alleviate the scourge, the weight of anti-Semitism?
I would say education. Education. Correct. Good education, not bad education.
We're talking about Christian young people. It's theological education. It's for more discussion about the Abrahamic covenant, about the need not to interpret every element of the Bible in this kind of loose figurative fashion, but rather to read it more as a word of God rather than, subject to whatever interpretation you want to place on it. It's the importance of recognizing the role that Israel is meant to play in the end times and the visions of what happens during those last days of humankind on earth. So that kind of education is very important. Exposure is important, right? We repeatedly find that exposure to the Jewish people, not even so much religious or even cultural traditions, but more, mundane kind of exposure, working with them, meeting them. These are the kinds of things that engender positive attitudes. Talking to other people that are pro-Israel about the importance of Israel for the Christian faith. Those kinds of conversations tend to have a very positive effect. Exposure. It doesn't always work, and it doesn't always generate positive feedback loop. But we find that most of the time it does.
Well, Kirill, Motti, I'm so grateful that you made it to appear here on our show. I know you're very busy, and so I'm doubly thankful for your time, for your expertise, for sharing with us such important topics. And as a Christian, I'm very thankful for the work that you're doing. And hopefully some people, many people, I would say, will be making an analysis of all this data so that we can improve the situation. Thank you very much. And I hope you can make it some other time.
Thanks for having us.
It's been a pleasure. So bye-bye, and thank you very much.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you want to know more about King's Evangelical Divinity School, visit our website, kingsdivinity.org, or follow us on social media. We will be more than glad to have you study with us if you are interested in any of our courses. See you on our next podcast.